Ross Franklin was born in 1917, the son of a milk factory worker and the third child in a family of 8. He left school at the age of 13 and worked as a fruit picker, road construction worker, seaman, grocer and soldier. His writing career began when he was 27, and his short stories were soon being published in magazines and anthologies in many languages. Ross Franklin's literary work covers perhaps the widest range of any Australian writer, from controversial novels to hit parade song lyrics.
So it was you who found the body, is that correct?
That's right, I found the body. Didn't know too much about him, said his name was Frank Rice. Spent a lot of time in his room, didn't go out much. Done a lot of writing, I think. Couldn't tell you too much about him.
Well-known author and communist Ross Franklin is dead at age 67. Franklin's body was found last night in this hotel in Collingwood. Police are still investigating the death and will make no comment at this stage. What is known for certain is that Franklin was working on a new novel about hire purchase companies, and the people, some would say thugs, they employ as repossession agents.
As far as I know, he was working on 2 books. One was a novel that described how an ordinary worker could take on the courts, the bailiffs and the finance system. And the second was a short booklet that described how a, victim of the blue paper men, as he called it, could take on the system.
Here in Johnston Street, Collingwood, was the location of John Wren's illegal tote, the first successful venture for a man whose life provided the basis for Franklin's 672-page novel. John West rose from a Melbourne slum to dominate Australian politics with bribery, corruption and fear. His wife and their children turned away from him in horror. Friends dropped away. At the peak of his power, surrounded by cringing bootlickers, West faced a hate-filled nation which bent at the knee until it finally bought release. Was John West a real figure?
Ross Franklin was a communist, a member of the Communist Party of Australia from 1940 until the day he died. He never lost his adherence to the politics of the left, nor his abiding concern for the socially disadvantaged. He rejected bourgeois ethics and claimed that he operated far outside the bourgeois world and just outside the communist group. He welcomed rejection, transmuting it into a creative capacity for alienation. Permeating these attitudes was an almost anarchic disrespect for manners and conventions.
Get his autograph. Back up, my dummy. Sorry.
Frank Hardy?
What are you doing here?
I got in touch with Barry Dickens. He told me you'd be here. I'm doing some work on Ross Franklin, and I was wondering, well, you knew him, didn't you? Did you know him well?
Yeah, I knew him well, I suppose anyone did. He became a recluse after his wife died. His only normal interest, in fact, was football. He barracked for Collingwood, and he thought it was funny. He was offended even by the fact that I, who lived in Collingwood all my life, barracked for Fitzroy, which I'm trying to do here today, right? There's a match going on.
Did you see him often in recent years?
Not often, nobody did. But I used to drop into his room at Collingwood occasionally, and he didn't even have the phone on, but I dropped into his room occasionally at Collingwood.
Not many people had an idea of what he was working on in the last year. Did you have any idea what it was?
Righto, Matt! You beauty! Take your time. What was that?
Nobody knew what he was working on in the last year. Did you have any idea what it was?
Well, he was obsessed with three things, really. He was obsessed with indebtedness as the main cause of human misery, and he saw it as a war between the finance sharks and their debt collectors against the poor, and a war between the rich nation and the poor nation.
Yeah. Did he finish that book?
Well, I hope the poor bastard finished it. He got murdered for it, didn't he? And he was also obsessed with the nature of truth. He was constantly discussing with me the nature of truth, and I think that was because he was worried whether that adultery scene in Power Without Glory was true or not. You see, some police agent was planted on him and told him about Nellie West's baby, and he also told him that he'd shot a fella called George Kirkland. He was always talking about that.
He wrote a book about it called Who Shot George Kirkland?
Yeah, he did, and it was funny. The critics thought it was fiction. One critic said, for the first time Franklin's written we welcome him writing some fiction. And the last time I saw Franklin before he was murdered, he told me it was the truest book he ever wrote in his bloody life. And there's a football match going on here, and I think Fitzroy will do them. And look, couldn't we wait till half-time and we can go up to the social club at half-time? I got a ticket, right, and we can talk about it then. Because I got to watch this bloody match. It's an important point. We've got to win this to have a chance of getting in the five.
In October 1950, only some weeks after the publication of Power Without Glory, Ross Franklin was arrested and charged with criminal libel. In court, he admitted that John West, the hero-villain of the book, was a composite fictional character based on aspects of the living person, John Wren. But it was not Wren himself who brought the charge against Franklin. It was Ellen Wren, John Wren's wife, who did so, claiming that Franklin had libelled her by writing that Nellie West, wife of John West in the book, had had an adulterous affair with a married man and had given birth to a child by him. It was the heart of the Cold War. In the United States, the McCarthyist purges were in full swing. And in Australia, the Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, was moving legislation to outlaw communism and communists. In this atmosphere, the Power Without Glory case became a national and international sensation overnight, causing headlines even in Europe. This experience indelibly marked Franklin. He didn't write another book for 10 years after his trial, and before he died he had written 2 lengthy novels which worked through the many issues of the writing and publication of Power Without Glory and the subsequent legal battle. In particular, the Nellie West adultery story obsessed him. It was told to him by a man named Alan Hall. Hall was an eccentric and an inventor, and Ross Franklin was convinced that he was also a member of the Australian Security Police. Franklin suspected that Hall had fed him the adultery story, hoping that he would use it in Power Without Glory, and thus provide the perfect grounds for a charge of criminal libel.
Thanks, George. Just wait round the corner for me, will you, mate? I won't be long.
We can talk in the office. Sit down.
You know why I've come. That Bill Egan and Alan Wren's stories are true.
As God is my witness. Bill Egan was married to my sister, remember?
Sister.
Why would I make up a story like that? You don't believe me, do you?
Why should I? You're a bloody Commonwealth cop, aren't you?
Listen, Ross. I'm an inventor. That means, essentially, I'm a problem solver. Okay. I might have done a few jobs for the Commonwealth lately. Immigration and smuggling, mainly. But I think I can help you, too. This is a truth drug. You don't trust me, and I don't trust you. Anyone who takes a teaspoon of this stuff tells the bloody truth. I'll take some. And so will you. You think I'm lying? What about you? You might be a communist spy, for all I know.
All right. After you.
Absolutely tasteless and harmless. In half an hour it'll work. And then I'll ask you what the communists are up to in the Labour Party. And you can ask me again about Bill Egan and Ellen Wren.
Alan Hall lived in a bloody fantasy world, somewhere between truth and fiction. He led me into this limbo, and I learnt there the true meaning of the irreconcilable feud between literature and reality. Was he just sounding off? Or was this a classical ploy of the agent provocateur supplying information to retain contact and credibility? If the story was false, did he want me to publish it and get into trouble? And if it was true? I was writing the last chapters of the novel while I was printing the first. The chapters about Nellie West and Bill Egan were never revised in any way after they were written. When reading the proofs, I felt no qualms about publishing those chapters. When selling the first copies at factory gates, the adultery scenes might as well not have been in the book for all I cared about them. It doesn't seem possible that when I wrote those scenes, I gave no thought to the certainty that all hell would break loose around my head if ever the book was published.
Right from the beginning in Power Without Glory, Franklin interweaved documentary material into novel form, and he did this in quite an extraordinary way. In fact, it created an entirely new theory of literature.
Yes, the last time I saw him, he told me that literature resides in the limbo world between empirical and imaginative truth. Now, that's a very new concept.
Yeah, and he created this new literary form years before Mailer claimed to have created novel as history, history as novel method, and Franklin did this in his book The Hard Way.
And he did it better than Mailer too, but he also was interested in ambiguity, ambivalence, the divided man, the division in society, contrapuntal division that overlapped. The last time I saw him, he played the Bach Fugue for several hours. Even one of his books were cast in the form of a fugue.
But his comments on the working class weren't only propaganda, were they?
On the class struggle theory he had, that you have to write about class struggle. But my belief is that although people said he overdid that, when he did, the capitalists were well-realised characters and the working class characters were well-realised characters.
And of course the extent of Franklin's contribution to literature can't really be established until his short stories, which were published by the Trade Union Journal, are rediscovered. And in fact I'm working on that now.
You mean the ones in the 40s?
Yeah.
Well, if you find Franklin's, have a look for some of mine, because he ran a sort of a syndicate. He sold stories for himself, for me, for John Morrison, Alan Marshall, Lance Luffrey, Eric Lambert and others. So if you find any of mine there as well as Franklin, let me have them. They're all lost.
And his habit in later years of writing under an assumed name, why did he do that?
Well, it's hard to say. Lawson, he was much influenced by Lawson. Lawson wrote under many pseudonyms. Joe Swallow, John Lawrence, Service Wright, C-E-R-V-U-S. He wrote anti-royalty poems, Lawson, under the name of Service Wright, which meant, I think he meant Service Wright for having a royal family, the ordinary woman that the English called the Queen. And I hope the Duke's parents dies and so on. But as for why Franklin did it, I don't know, because he wrote, you'll never find them, because I know he wrote love poems, he wrote surrealistic poems for fashionable journals under false names, I think just to send them up.
Right.
Because they didn't think he was a good writer, he did it for fun.
But his characters
I think they really did it, quite frankly, because they were beginning to live in some unreal world and were going around the bend, but that's what I believe.
And did you know him in 1950 when Power Without Glory was being published?
Know him? I was on the Defend Franklin committee.
What was he like?
In those days, well, his mate Sealap, George, who helped him print the book illegally, he told me that he laughed a lot. Now, Franklin in that time had a great sense of humour. He seemed to enjoy that because he was being treated as a revolutionary. He was being attacked.
He told us a very funny story outside the court immediately after the last trial was over and he was acquitted. He reckoned that a woman in the gallery, just when the jury came out to give their verdict, threw a bit of paper, and she said, "Ross," and threw a bit of paper, and the paper floated like a butterfly over the heads of the police and the lawyers in the court. And Franklin thinks, my God, this paper will have written on it something like, "Don't worry, Ross, my brother's on the jury," he told us. And it floated until it fell down on the seat beside him in the dock where he was standing. So he grabbed it and he put it in his overcoat pocket. And so he tells us that then in the meantime, while this paper's floating around, the jury gives us verdict of not guilty. So he's terrified the judge is going to say, "I want to see that bit of paper," and that it would have something incriminating written on it about the jury. So he laughed that much at his own joke outside the court, telling me and Sealap and a few of them there, that he forgot to show me the bloody bit of paper. I don't know what was written on it to this day.
But his working class characters were truly authentic, weren't they?
Yes, I read an essay one time somewhere, working class characters in Ross Franklin's fiction. And I was reminded of all the great working class characters he created, not necessarily political characters, but he understood the working class, what they ate, where they lived, what they did for pleasure, how they coped with life. And of course he had a marvellous ear for working class speech, because he lived amongst them in Collingwood. He mixed with nobody else. He never went to any functions or book launchings or fashionable art galleries or gatherings. He never won any prizes. So his ear remained good for the working class speech and for their way of life.
Yeah, I was back with Franklin, but he sorted me out. I didn't approach him. I'd had some experience with gangsters in the 20s and 30s, and he asked me about that for his book. It was all the truth. I don't know what he wrote in that book, but everything I told Ross Franklin was the bloody truth.
Franklin is altogether too programmatic. He shows little sensitivity to writing. In some ways, he's hardly a novelist at all. Power Without Glory is a long-winded, ambitious, documentary study of corruption and extortion. It's clumsy in its structure and its style, and is only partly salvaged by Franklin's moral fervour. Like any writer who starts out with a doctrine to propound, he hardly ever arrives at the quality of life and experience. And that is the essence of any lasting work. Franklin's true ear is for the anecdote, the pub yarn.
After my release on bail, Nellie West and Bill Egan haunted me like ghosts. If the adultery episode had been chosen by the prosecution to hide John Wren's criminal past and dubious business and political history from public view, it succeeded admirably. Worse than that, although I am vigorously supported by a minority of workers and intellectuals, the majority of people oppose me. In this period of McCarthyite hysteria, some treat me with disdain and even hatred. I get abused on the telephone by strangers in the street.
The first case covers the use of the real name of a real person. Billy Hughes, for example, or the English working class leader, Tom Mann. The second case covers most of the minor characters in the book, invented characters with invented names. The third class is what Franklin terms the composite fictional character. Certain characteristics of real people are brought together under an invented name, with the name often suggesting the original: John West, John Wren, Archbishop Malone and Archbishop Mannix, Snoopy Tanner and the gangster Squizzy Taylor. And in the fourth category, Franklin cites the example of Eddie Corrigan, where an actual name and the hint of a character are taken from a newspaper article and placed in entirely fictional circumstances. Critics have alleged that even in his choice of names, Franklin displays a failing of the imagination, that is more a documenter than a novelist. He's accused of stealing material from a host of authors ranging from Lawson to Mayakovsky and Solzhenitsyn, and even of borrowing too heavily from his own life and writings. Accusations of this nature betray an aesthetic that freezes texts in history, as though they were not always in the process of being read, rewritten, reappropriated and reproduced, and they completely overlook the break that a work like Power Without Glory makes with dominant production relations, the way it subverted the still dominant literary critical distinctions between fiction and literature and documentary and history. Franklin's work is indeed a challenge to these conventions, and in much of his work, Franklin displays a remarkable capacity for self-examination, self-criticism and self-satire, in short, for the techniques of reflexiveness that are characteristic of modernist cultural production.
We beat him.
Good on you, Ross.
Thank you. Oh, thanks. What's your name?
Liz.
Thanks.
Good on you, Ross.
Good on you. Good to see you. How are you, Nellie?
Good to know you. Terrific.
G'day. Maureen, how are you? Great to see you.
Congratulations,
Oh, thanks. Hey, Bobby, how you going? Haven't seen you for ages. Kenny, good on you, mate. Thanks for coming. Yeah.
Later, Ross Franklin told me that the only truth worth examining was one which could not be told. He said that that's why literature existed, to tell those truths. And he said that the journey in search of truth had no other destination except itself. He felt that truth was eternal as time and as limitless as space. He said to me once, truth can turn backwards on itself so that you arrive at the same place at the same time, and every book should end with the question it sets out to answer. In the last years, he became the bane, the absolute bane of the Australian literary establishment. He wrote in his books, he wrote letters to the editor in magazines, and his main target was Dame Leonie Bloody Kramer herself, whom he believed, and I think rightly, had led 2 generations of university students to believe that literature was about words and images, that George Orwell was not a fascist right-wing shit, and that any literature dealing with the real problems of real life and real people was simply propaganda. Above all, it festered in him that Lawson was treated so badly by Kramer and the establishment, that the work of Henry Lawson, that they gutted it and removed its revolutionary kernel. He said to me one night when listening to a Bach fugue, "I'd rather be forgotten forever than to be remembered the way they've remembered Lawson, with the guts cut out of him." And he felt that the future of writers and their names and the future of literature depended on class struggle. And I said, how does it depend on class struggle? You can write about it. He said, it depends on it. If Australia remains capitalist, they'll still believe that the so-called poets who write prettily about nothing are the esteemed writers, and you or I will be treated like outcasts. If the workers win the struggle, our literary esteem and our posterity will go down. We'll be victorious with them. This was Franklin country here. He lived here amongst these workers' houses and factories. He wrote about these people who live here. He was one of them. And he used to be fond of quoting Lawson's wonderful poem, "I took my pen in tears and triumph, and I wrote it down for them." He said that's the job of a working class writer, is to express the class outlook and the feelings and the lives and manners of working men and women. And he loved to quote near the end, when I think perhaps he was going a bit around the twist. He used to say, looking at these mean streets and unpainted lanes, "These are my people and I am with them to the end." And he was with them to the end.